We are starting a series today, as Gary mentioned last week, that we've titled Radical Hospitality. And it is a kind of term that is floating around church worldwide at the moment. It's this term that goes on. But I really kind of want to start, as we look at this, to really start with the why question as to why radical hospitality, why is it important? And I suppose where it fits into this wider question of God's big idea, of God's story, of who he is, and what is the significance, that it's not just something that you kind of pluck out of the air somewhere and think this sounds good and looks good and everything else, so let's try this. So I really wanted to start off this morning with unpacking a little bit of the why. And if you want a whistle-stop tour of the Bible, of God's story, then you don't really need to look any further than the book of Romans. So if you kind of want to get a big picture idea of the whole of the Bible, then do a study of the book of Romans, because Paul, as he's written Romans, he unpacks the full journey of salvation. He unpacks it from the beginning. He unpacks the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and not just why it fulfills the law, but why it is part of God's great plan to restore humanity to himself, wider than just Israel, the original chosen people, but you and I, every person. And he goes through this, and he brings it to how God has brought us out of our sin and into freedom and into hope, and that we are and can be saved and brought into God's family. And if you read through Romans chapters 1 to 11, Paul does this great unpacking story narrative of this whole journey from the beginning to how sin has interrupted everything, and how Jesus brings about redemption for whole of mankind. And there's this whole unpacking, chapters 1 to 11. But then all of a sudden, in the book of Romans, you get to chapter 12. And it's like right in the middle of this letter to the Romans, right in the middle of this book, that the entire thing kind of changes, this kind of narrative changes a little bit. And what he does is he goes on to then unpack what is our response to God's mercy. If this is what God has done for us, if this is the journey that God has done, what he's been fulfilled through Jesus, if this is what God has done, the question kind of hits right of a sudden in chapter 12 to say, what does that change in us? How does our new relationship with God, how does the reality of our salvation, how does that then impact on our everyday lives? What is the change that happens? So we're going to have a look at this, if that's all right. Have a look on the significance of what is our response to God. What is that response? So we're going to start, and we're going to look at Romans 12 to get a picture of this. And Romans 12, 1 and 2 is a well-known couple of verses to many people. And it says this, therefore, so in light, if it's therefore, it relates to what's gone before, but it's a change. And so he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, so in view of everything that has gone before, in view of all of what's gone on, our response is to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and improve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. So in view of God's mercy, in view of God's grace, in view of all that God has done, what we do from here, what he's calling us to do from here, is a direct response, is our direct response to God. And at this time when the Apostle Paul is writing this letter, both for the Jews of the time and their background in the law, and also it's written to the Romans and the culture of the time for others who would worship other gods, there was a really common practice thing that took place, which is offering offerings and sacrifices, whether it be to God himself or if they worshipped other idols to the gods. Offerings was something that would be commonplace take place. So this is in the light of the people's understanding of what worship is. This is what Paul is talking about, this is what worship to God should be. Now he's saying, your understanding is worship should be offerings of sacrifices and animals and various things. That's how, up until now, all people have worshipped. But this is what worship to God, this is our response to God, what it should be. Now, when we look back at Leviticus 6, there's an unpacking of the directions that Moses gave towards offerings that would take place to God. And one of the offerings that would give place is a guilt and a sin offering. Now, that would be an offering of an animal that would come and be given and sacrificed on behalf of an individual or of the group, to say, we are bringing an offering to God to ask for forgiveness for our sin, to atone for our sin. So the recognition that there is a consequence to the disobedience that they've done against God. And so this offering would come and they would sacrifice an animal to say, this is in my place. Now, what Paul has said previous to this is that Jesus is that offering. That because Jesus has gone to the cross and died and sacrificed himself, there's no longer a need for individuals to go to the temple and offer an animal sacrifice, because Jesus has been that sacrifice once and for all. But then he's going on and saying, so Jesus has been that sacrifice for once and for all, so what is our response? And you see, there's another offering that would have been familiar to the people, and this was a burnt offering. So there are 4 different offerings in Leviticus that are unpacked, and it's a burnt offering. And a burnt offering was an act of worship. A burnt offering is something that the people would bring as a thanks and a gratitude to God, to say, I'm coming with this offering for the whole sole purpose is I want to give my worship to God. I want to worship you. And do you know what is special about this offering is when this offering was brought, the whole animal was consumed, the whole thing was given in worship to God. None of it was kept back for the priests or anything else. The whole thing was given to God. So what is Paul saying in these verses? Is he's saying that our response to God is to give an offering of a living sacrifice of our bodies to God. What Paul is saying is you need to change the way you think about worship. That the worship that God is looking for is not that you would bring animals and sacrifices that you would be used to, but the worship that God is looking for is that you bring your whole self to God, the whole thing, your bodies. It's a tangible act, it's a tangible thing of your whole lives and your whole selves to God, and you bring it as your act of worship. And he says, I need to renew your mind. I need you to change the way you think about worship. That worship isn't something that takes place in the temple. Worship isn't something that takes place in the church building. It can be. Worship isn't something that takes place by ceremonies. It's not something that takes place by systems. Worship isn't coming and singing a song and doing what we do on a Sunday. That's not worship. He's saying, I need you to renew your minds about what worship is. Worship is giving your entire self as a sacrifice back to God. That is your thanks offering back to God. That is your praise back to God. That is your worship back to God. And so what he then begins to do in Romans chapter 12 is he's given this story about what Jesus has done for us. And then the narrative changes and he says, okay, in response to God, in response to what God has done, we need to renew our minds, we need to renew our thinking, we need to change our thoughts about what worship looks like. Worship is a giving of your whole self to God. And then he goes on to discuss through chapters 12 and beyond about what changes, what does that look like in our lives? How does that play out in our lives? How does that worship look? If it's not a physical offering, what does it look like? And so we're going to take a look today at some of the verses in Romans 12 further on. If you want to look at more about that life of worship, you can listen back to a couple of weeks ago because we talked about it. But we're going to have a look today at a little bit later on in Romans 12 where Paul is unpacking practically what does that kind of life of worship look like. And so Romans 12 verse 9, is we're going to start here. And it says this: love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So in these verses, Paul begins to unpack that the essence of worship, our response to God's grace, in one aspect is reflected in how we love. Love is an action. This is titled Love in Action. That it's reflected, our worship to God is reflected in how, as an action, we love others. And he's talking and he's describing a love that goes beyond the norm. He's talking about a love that is radical. He's talking about a love that is not natural. This is not our normal way to behave. This is not how we normally express love to one another. This is a radical sort of love. He's not talking about being nice. He's not talking about polite, smiley, affectionate, chilling out, hanging out, spending time. He's talking about something that goes deeper. And he sums it up by encouraging people to practice this thing called hospitality. Now, for something, as we've titled it, to be radical hospitality, radical means that it has to affect the fundamental nature of something. So this type of hospitality is fundamentally different to basic hospitality, which is a generous reception of entertainment of guests and strangers. So if I was to sum up radical hospitality, I would say it's the practice of putting extraordinary effort and emphasis, not just in making people feel, but making people be welcome. So there is this call that we would go out of our way to put extra emphasis on making people be welcome. If you want to unpack this, if we're going to be individuals, if you and I, if we're going to be individuals, and if we're going to be a church that offers to live lives that worship God, that we're going to be centered on who Jesus is and what he's done, if we're going to radiate that love to others in our worship, that to worship God wholly and fully, we need to expand and we need to change the way that we embrace others in a radical way, which is the way that Jesus embraces others. We need to change the way we think. But how does this practically look in a biblical way? I'm going to read you a story in Luke's Gospel, in Luke 19. And it says this. It says, Jesus entered through Jericho and was passing through. And a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he couldn't see over the crowd. You want a bit of interesting fact I discovered this week. Jan can clarify for us, maybe. She can look into this for us. She knows better than me. But apparently, if you look into the original grammar of the way this sentence is written, it's not actually clear if the person who was short was Zacchaeus or Jesus. Interesting info drop there. If you read the original, it says that he couldn't see because he was short, but it doesn't know if it refers to the fact Zacchaeus was short or Jesus was short and he couldn't be seen over the crowd. There we go. Sorry, I just like those wee bits of trivia. It's fascinating. There's hope for some short people out there. No, just kidding. Okay, so totally off point that. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And so he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be with a guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give you half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." I love this story. See, here we have a man who, by his own choices, was rejected, by his own choices, outcast, by his own choices is on the edge of society, to such a point that I'm sure if he'd wanted to get to Jesus, he could have elbowed his way through the crowd to get to Jesus into the middle, like probably many people were doing. But he felt so much distant from everybody else that he felt he couldn't do that. He couldn't get through. He didn't want to push through. Instead, he tried to look from a distance. And then this unimaginable thing happens, that Jesus invites himself over to his house for dinner, which I would love to have the audacity to just go up to people and say, "I'm coming to your house for dinner today," because you know they're a good cook or something, you know, that would just be really bold, but hey. And Zacchaeus is just so delighted that Jesus, who was this prophet, this person that everybody was following, he's heard so much about, he wanted to come and hang out with him. There's a whole context in there for that's part of the story, that he welcomes him gladly and has Jesus over to his house for a meal. But if we are wanting to grasp radical hospitality, we need to first understand a key, which I think is outlined in this story. So I want to ask you a question, that who in this story is emulating radical hospitality? Is it Jesus or is it Zacchaeus? Which person is emulating radical hospitality? Zacchaeus, who opened his home and is to Jesus and invited him around for dinner, or Jesus, who invited himself over for dinner? Put your hand up if you think it was Jesus. Put your hand up if you think it was Zacchaeus. There's a lot of no hands going up because you're too scared. And it's good, it's great. The answer, which Gary will say is the answer to everything, is Jesus. That it's Jesus in this scenario who is emulating radical hospitality. Gary always says, if you don't know the answer, just see Jesus. And you're normally 90% of the time right, especially if you're in Sunday school. So it's good. So you see, radical hospitality is not about bringing people into our homes. Radical hospitality is about bringing people into our lives. Radical hospitality is not this idea of entertaining. Radical hospitality is this idea of opening oneself up and sharing. When Jesus saw Zacchaeus in this story, he stopped and he made time and space in his life for him. It was an intentional, authentic invitation for personal relationship that was disruptive to Jesus' day. That in that moment, Jesus had his plans, he had his stuff that he was doing, he had loads of people about, lots to do, lots going on, he had his life. In that moment, he saw Zacchaeus and genuinely from the bottom of his heart stopped to desire and gave an invitation for relationship that was disruptive to his own day. That is radical hospitality. That is what it is. And that is what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks. What does this look like? And so there's 4 keys. There might be more, 4 that stand out to me that I feel that are keys to what radical hospitality is. So if we're back into Romans 12, verse 9, it says, love must be first and foremost sincere. To practice radical hospitality, first of all, it has to be authentic. It has to be genuine. It has to be sincere. If we are going to radiate the love of Jesus to others, it has to first and foremost be authentic. People are smart. People have radars. People know when you're spending time with them because you need to. People know when you're doing something out of duty. And people know when you're doing something because you genuinely want to be there with them. People know. That if we are going to radiate the love of Jesus through this radical hospitality, we need first and foremost, our love has to be authentic. We need to genuinely desire other people to be part of our lives, and that might be easier and more natural for some people than others. For the introverts in the room, that's hard sometimes. Yeah, we quite like our own space. We quite like our own wee comforts. That can be hard, but we need to come to God and be honest and say to God, God, I know this is something that you've called us to do. I know this is part of what worship is. I know this is part of radiating your love. So God, give me a heart like yours. God, change my heart, that it responds the way you respond, that I love the way you love, that I see what you see, that I can follow your direction and genuinely, authentically open my heart to others. Verse 12 says, be devoted to one another, to honor one another above yourselves. And the second thing that radical hospitality is, it's authentic, but it's also personal. It's personal. That it's opening something within yourself to somebody else. Now, I'm not saying that you sit down with somebody and you pour out all your secrets and all your mess that's in your life and just go blah, and that's personal. That's not what I mean by personal. Personal, I mean, is devoting your own time and space and attention to somebody that's there. You know, when somebody's sitting with you and there's the genuine eye contact, that this is a conversation between 2 people, that it's real. And maybe it is simply revealing. Sometimes it is revealing some of your mess, not all of your mess, but sometimes it's just saying, hang on a minute, I'm going to be real. I'm not going to put on this facade that says, hey, I've got it sorted, look at me. Sometimes it's being real. Maybe it is being personal, is saying, actually, here's my personal phone number. Like, access to me. I'm giving you access to my life. Maybe it is inviting somebody into your home, into your personal space. Maybe it is sharing a bit of your story. I don't know what personal looks like, and every situation is different. But radical hospitality is both authentic and it's personal. It's also intentional. Verse 11 says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. All these things take intentionality. There's something in loving others that requires intentionality. It doesn't happen by chance. Love is an action. I'm not talking about a feeling, I'm talking about an action. And action requires thought. Action requires thinking. What am I going to do? And it's saying, God, open my eyes to see. And we're going to cover this in the coming weeks a little bit. But it's love in action is saying, where can I make space? What does that person need? It's intentionality element to it. And the fourth thing is it's disruptive. It's everyone's favorite. Verse 13 says, share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality. Loving others like Jesus. Living out radical hospitality requires a giving of yourself. It requires sacrifice. And we're going to talk about this more. So I don't want to go, I'm like tempted just to keep talking because I love this subject. But if we want to be a people that radiate the love of Jesus authentically, which is an act of worship, worshiping God is loving others as he's called us to love them. It's showing his love to others. then first of all, it's disruptive to our lives. We have to be prepared to let our lives get a little bit messy. I like order. I'm going to be honest. I'm one of these people that plan everything in the day, and I do have a minor panic attack meltdown when plans change. I honestly do. And I try really, really, really hard to be a little bit more moving, but I like to know what's happening. And so when something changes, I panic for about 5 minutes, and then I hyperventilate, and then it's like, it's okay, it's fine, everything's good. You might be like me. I know there are people that are like me. But it's allowing our lives to be disrupted, to be authentic, intentional, and personal. It's always about the other person and creating space in our lives, an environment that makes them feel valued and accepted. And this is the type of church we want to be, both as individuals and as a people. We want to be people who radiate the love of Jesus by making space in our lives for others. But you know, it first starts with God. It first starts with Him. It's all about our worship to God, that we cannot make room in our lives for others that emulate the light and radiance of God if we don't first make room for God Himself. Because this type of love and action, this type of love, this type of hospitality, it is not natural. It's not something as human beings we naturally do. It's something that comes from God. It's something that comes from Him. And if we try and do it on our own, it likely won't be authentic. It will be hard, it will be challenging, but when we allow God to come in, when we allow God to shape our hearts and our lives, as we allow Him and we spend time with His presence, and we allow the Spirit to change us and move us, then we become individuals who love others authentically and personally, that we make space and intentionality in our lives. So I suppose I want to finish with these questions that I think are things that I know for me, I want us to think about this week in terms as we move into this season of thinking about radical hospitality, is first think about our own lives, and are we radically hospitable to the presence of God in our lives? Do we make room for God in our lives first and foremost? Is my desire for God authentic? Do I authentically desire God's presence? If not, it's like, God, I want your presence more than anything. I want to want your presence. So God, just move my heart for this. Is my relationship with God personal? Do I open myself up to Him? I think sometimes, I speak personally, when you go to God and you're feeling a little bit like, you've done stuff you shouldn't, or you're not in a good place, sometimes you kind of like, a bit of yourself you maybe hold back and close. It's like, are we personal? Do we let God in? Do we open that up? Does it go beyond a meeting on a Sunday? Does it go into your personal space, your personal life? Is your relationship with God as personal? Do we make room for God? Is it intentional? Making space for God, being radically hospitable of the presence of God? Do we intentionally make space for God in our lives? Do we talk to Him, hear from Him? I know for me, is it disruptive? Do I allow God to disrupt my life? When I feel God telling me to do something that's uncomfortable, when I know that I need to push through in something, but actually I would rather be doing something else because it's more comfortable, do we push through? Is it disruptive? There have been points in my life I do things different ways, but I'm at this stage in my life right now where from the moment my son wakes up to the moment we go to bed at night, I don't have a great deal of time and space. So if I want to make space for God, I know I have to intentionally get up earlier. Now, that's not always the case. It's not always been the case of how I've done it. But for me right now, I know if I'm going to make space for God in my life, I have to get up earlier because that's the only time that I can make something. And I am not somebody who likes waking up to an alarm. I'm not. But it's disruptive and it's intentional, and that's the space where I can meet with God, and that is making myself radically hospitable to the presence of God, and then saying, God, shape me, change me more like you, and just allowing myself and my life to be disrupted. It looks different to you. That's not a formula. But it's looking at our lives and saying, how do I make space for God? How do I make space for his presence? Do I allow him in? Do I make room? I'm going to invite the worship guys back up just now, if that's all right. If we are to be disciples of Jesus, if we are to sit at his feet and emulate him, if we are to live lives that authentically worship God, if we want to live lives that authentically worship him, whole lives, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, whole lives that worship God, then we need to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. We need to renew our minds about what worship looks like. And we need to first make room for him so that we have all we need to make room for others. There's a making room for God so that he can move and shape our hearts and our lives and our mindsets, that we can make room for other people and that we can radiate that love that we have in that place with him to other people authentically in every aspect of our life, and not in a basic way, but in a radical way. It's not making room in our homes, though it can be that, but it's making room in our lives, making space, allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable, allowing things to change, allowing things to move. And that's the kind of church that we want to be, a church that's radically hospitable, both of the presence of God, but of the people that he loves, that we would be that. So this morning, I hope that this has challenged us. I know it challenges me as I study this. That we'd move and we'd be pushing ourselves forward to ask the question, God, I want to live a life that worships you. So what does that look like? Renew my mind. If my mindset about what that looks like isn't wholly what you mean for it to be, then renew my mind as I give my life, my whole life to you in a radical way that loves others as well as you. So it'd be great. We're going to worship just now. It'd be great if we could stand. Let's stand together. If you want, you can stay seated. If you prefer, let's stand. And let's just bring ourselves before God, because the key in all of this, the very start of Romans 12, as I read, it says that this is what it is in view of God's mercy. That everything is in view of the mercy that God has given us. Everything is in view of who Jesus is and what he has done for us on the cross. Everything that we give not because we have to, not because of anything else, but we give it because we want to worship God and give back to him more and more than what we have before, in a way that worships him back for what he has given to us. And so this morning, Lord Jesus, as we come before you, God, as we look to you and we look to who you are, as we look to what you have done for us on the cross, as we look to your death and resurrection, as we look to all we have received in freedom and hope and forgiveness and grace and mercy, and in view of you, God, that this morning, God, we want to offer ourselves back to you. We want to live lives that wholly worship you, God, that honor you with our lives, God. And we just pray that this morning that you would change our minds, you would renew our minds, and you would change our hearts. That we would look, God, at our lives differently, in a way that we want to honor you in every aspect, but that you would let us see our lives in the way you see them. And God, that you would move our hearts to love radically in a way that you have taught us to love. That we would emulate you in all areas of our lives, God. We just pray that this morning, as we start this journey, God, I just pray that you would both renew my heart, my mind, and change my heart. More and more every day, that I would make space in my life for you And for those that you bring before me, God, that I would be a somebody who practices a life of radical hospitality, of your presence, and also of your people, God. That I would radiate you all around, God, in the way I am, that is radical, that is different, that goes beyond the norm, that it brings change to people's lives because I open up and make space in my life for them. That is our prayer this morning, and we love you. And we want to worship you wholly and fully and truly. Thank you, Jesus. Yeah. Yes, God.